I wanted to uh, continue a little bit on the tool um, uh, subject that I talked about in the first video. Um, and when I said that you don't need much in the way to get started, either clock or watch repair, I meant that. Um, you don't have to have um, things that you're going to use later maybe in the future. If money is tight, you get what you need right now. And what you need right in the beginning, especially if you are just starting, and you might have a little theory behind you, some technique behind you, a little bit of skill behind you, but still just starting out, you really don't need much of anything. For watches, you need a good set of tweezers, a decent set of screwdrivers. Those are important that you get good quality because you're actually holding parts and dealing with parts that are very tiny right off the bat. Because what you're going to work on is getting your dexterity down anyway. And so it's not a bad idea to have decent tools as far as those go. But they are inexpensive in comparison to many of the machines and whatnot that people think they need. Case openers, things like that. It adds up very quickly. And if you spend all the money that you have for this hobby or a future profession, maybe, then you may come to a wall where you have to wait for a while for the next tool. And that can be discouraging for people. So just get what you absolutely need. Now, I'm going to add something to this that will help um, make clear what it was I was talking about, what I was trying to say. And it's a story that I think that you'll be very intrigued with. You may have heard of this watchmaker, and it doesn't matter, and it could be a clockmaker again, um, but you might have heard of him, but probably not, especially if you haven't been doing this for very long. He was a rather obscure watchmaker in Europe, and he just died recently, 12 years ago in 2014. And he's somebody that I followed as much as possible. He was very obscure outside of his circle where he was kind of well known. And I followed him because he was an unusual man in a very good way. And there was a lot to learn from him and his character. So I followed where I could, very few articles to read about him. You can pick up some things on the forums and words from friends that what they have heard. And some of what they passed on to me was not really kind words about him or the way that he did things, which I completely disagree with now, and you probably will too by the end of this. So we'll get started. First, his name is Richard Miklosch. He lived in Germany and was a part-time watchmaker. In his teens, he pursued studying watches and learning what he could about them as a pastime. And by the end of his high school years, he had two passions and another thing that he did that was almost a passion. Passion number one, watchmaking. Passion number two was photography. And number three was mathematics. Apparently, he was pretty adept at math in school. And his counselor was giving advice to all the students on what to do as far as a profession. And Richard had told him what, and I'll use his first name a lot here, like I know him. I did not know him. It's just that I followed him so much that it's like he's a friend. His counselor told him and told the class, apparently, that if you choose your passion, I don't remember the exact words, but if you choose your passion as a profession, the love affair will soon part ways, or something like that. And Richard Miklosch went ahead and chose mathematics, and he became a math teacher. I think a high school math teacher for the next 40 years, and retired. And whether that was good advice or not, maybe it is for some, and maybe it isn't for others. But for Miklosch, I guess it was, because he was happy that he retired as a school teacher and now could devote full time to his passion. But during that time, he was still educating himself, and he would go to East Germany during a time when I guess it wasn't, I don't know if they could pass the wall, but you had to jump through hoops, I think, to do that. And he would go there and learn from two of the greatest 19th century watchmakers, or are going down as two of the greatest, or 20th century watchmakers. And that is Alfred Helwig and Gustav Gerstenberger, both renowned watchmakers. They taught at the Glashütte school in East Germany, a famous school, and both of them, I think, spent like 40 years there teaching. Gerstenberger is known for the Gerstenberger tables, which was a highly complicated mathematical thing that he did for the terminal curve, the shape of the terminal curve on the hairsprings for chronometers. And those tables became extremely famous and are used to this day, especially on some of the German watches being made now. So Gerstenberger also was famous for chronometer making, very renowned, perfect timekeeping chronometers. And Helwig was the inventor, and he did much more than this, but he was the inventor and is best known for the flying tourbillon, which is used in a lot of the wristwatches now and some pocket watches. But it was a huge leap forward when it comes to tourbillons. And Richard Miklosch learned everything he could from both of them. But his main teacher was Gerstenberger. And it could be because Gerstenberger apparently was very adept himself in mathematics. And he might have taken to Miklosch because of his mathematics background. I'm just assuming that. I don't know. But they only took on certain students in that school or in the curriculum. And apparently he was one of them. Now, or he may have just been tutored. I don't know all the details. But I think either Gerstenberger or it was Helwig taught like 800 students in his lifetime, in his career there. So these two men were extremely well known. They were Miklosch's mentors and possibly friends. I think Gerstenberger was kind of a friend, did some extra things for him, and his teachers. And so he learned from the best, and he carried on their tradition in his watches. He only concentrated on chronometers. The Earnshaw chronometer escapement was his favorite, and he felt that was the finest escapement ever made. And I think I would probably agree with that. So that's what he used, and he built tourbillons, and he built flying tourbillons. He didn't put any novelty types gadgets in there, repeating mechanisms or any kind of strike mechanism or or anything. As far as I know, he didn't put hardly any complications. Yeah, he did make flying uh, mainspring barrels, that type of thing in there, and used up and down indicators, simple things like that, but no real complications. And but he just perfected his skills, and for him, it was about perfecting his skills. It wasn't about selling a watch. He took very few commissions over the years. He did take some, but he wasn't looking for those. Of course, he had a career, but even still, that was not his motivation. And you'll also see that tools were not his motivation at all. Um, Building his skills, learning about himself, what he was capable of doing, perfecting, 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 always over the years. And he did do some repair, preservation work, restoration work um, in the beginning, for the beginning years or whatever. Now, I don't know if that was taking it in from the outside or the watches he was actually purchasing himself, acquiring himself for his collection, because he was an avid collector of clocks and watches. And the clocks that I have seen in his shop are regulators. So I think he was more after the precision timekeeping. And his thing was to try to make things as precise as he could and always improve his hand technique, his skills. He would work, an example of that, his watches, when he would make a tourbillon carriage, and I'm assuming you know what those are, but if you don't, you can look those up. It's not an easy thing to build. Tourbillon is a very difficult mechanism to build. And he would do the carriages in the hardened state or a tempered state. He would harden, temper, and then use a diamond file and do all the shaping. And it took him months. But his reason for that, and this is what Helwig also did, was that, and it's true, if you do it in the softer state before hardening, if you file it, shape it to everything you need, then you heat treat and you draw the temper, you get distortion. And with even today's modern metallurgy, you still get or can get some distortion. But it can be very apparent in its poising afterwards. And so he did it the hard way. And he didn't need to. He wasn't really motivated to sell these watches. They were for him. And you'll see that also in a few minutes. I'll show you that. So he was driven by perfecting his own abilities and learning what he could do and the passion for it. He was passionate from day one as a kid, and he never, ever lost that passion. But now for the tools, okay? What he used, most watchmakers or people that preserve watches or that are, really into it, or independent watchmakers that are actually building watches, the very least, most of them have like a bigger Schaublin lathe or something like that. They're not cheap, but it's something that many people just can say, well, you have to have that, okay? Or something comparable. I have a Hardage, okay, the American version, you might say, of a Schaublin. But that's the assumption, is you need to have that at least. And you need to have, a jig bore machine if you're going to be building watches, the very least, if you don't have a CNC. Or you need to have a CNC, which many of the independents have CNCs. In fact, I would say most of them have something in the way of a CNC now. So you need a larger lathe. Another thing would be an optical comparator, a profile projector. There you go. That is a huge help on if you're making parts for watches, which if you're doing restoration or preservation of older watches, you're making the parts if they're broken or if they're worn. And a profile projector just really, really helps. It's a big addition, and they're not all that expensive. But he didn't have that. What he had were a lot of hand tools that he just accumulated over the years, and about a dozen 8mm lathes. He didn't need a dozen. He did it for efficiency. And I'm sure he picked them up, inexpensively over the years, as most of us have. That's how we get our stuff. And what he would do is he would set up each 8mm lathe that he has with a certain task for making his watches. And I would assume that most of his watches used pretty much the same gear ratios, same module size gears as much as possible, so that all he had to do was cut one module or one gear, then grab another lathe, put it on his bench, we'll talk about that, cut another gear. Didn't have to go through the setup, okay, which is tedious, can be tedious. Some of us enjoy doing the setup. I like that stuff, but it does get in the way, I mean, it's just, it's time consuming. And he was mostly interested in building his skills. He wanted to do the things that had something to do with making the watch. And he usually built several watches at one time. He'd have them going. He'd just grab different things. So he would have these lathes, 10 to 12 lathes all set up. And so he didn't need all that. It was just to make him more efficient. And obviously it was an accumulation over years. He also had a rounding up tool. He had 7 rounding up tools, from what I understand. And he would do the same thing. And he didn't even need rounding up tools. The reason he used them was for aesthetic purposes only, to give the tooth on the train wheels, the wheels that can be seen, a special tooth form. Not the addendum, not the cycloidal form. It was the same as any cutter would do, cycloidal cutter, but for the base, the root. He wanted a deeper cut and a flat bottom for aesthetic purposes only. So that's something that he enjoyed, that he liked. And he would set up each one of those machines the same way he did the lathe, one for each module, and have his cutters set up, because they take time to set up. And he would just grab what he needed, make room on his bench, and use that machine and then put it back. Okay. I keep saying grabbing, picking up, putting back down, okay? And if you look closely amidst all this, you'll see that there's an 8mm lathe sitting out there on a board, mounted on a board, and there's another one over there. And I'm sure he had others in other places. If from what I understand, his room was a decent sized room on the 3rd floor of his home. And his work area was about 8 by 5 or so, or 8 by 10, whatever. About, from what I can put together from the things I've read, it was about 40 to 50 square feet. This is actual working area. Excuse me. And his watch bench was up against the window. I guess it only had one window, and he was up against there. I don't think I've ever seen a picture of his actual watch bench. I don't know, but the people who have visited him said that's where it was. But in all of this, what we would consider, or most people would consider, mess, okay, he made these watches, exceptional watches, with basic tools for all those years in that room. And if you look at his watches and his work areas, you'll see why I say he would have had to clear out a space to put a lathe there to work. There you go. Those are watches he's completed or that he's still working on. Some of them he has completed. He did a watch for Piaget, a commission, and it's there underneath the paper, piece of paper. So he got a lot of criticism for this, or some criticism. Friends told me they heard quite a bit about it. I never heard that much. It was hearsay. I think more it was critiquing with respect. Okay, but that you don't do it this way. That you don't hold a watch in your hand to do the work, which he did. He would hold it and ream out a hole. He would hold the carriage to do the filing in his hand. These are considered not really ethical ways of doing it, but you can't argue with it. I mean, when you see the great results that he had, but some people had to say things. They had to judge it. Okay, those are the things that attracted me. The fact that he was doing it his way, that he knew what he wanted, that he had the courage to have people come up and apparently didn't tell him not to take pictures and just ignored it, ignored any criticism he might have ever heard. If he ever heard it, maybe he didn't hear anything about it. But this is the way he did it with the tools he wanted to use. And that to me gets a lot of respect from me. And I only wish I could have met him. I had hoped to, but again, he passed away, far too young, I feel. I think he was 75 when he died in 2014. And I was hoping someday I would be able to maybe meet him. Not so much to learn technique, even though I'm sure he could have taught me a lot about the watches he worked on. But it wasn't about that. It was to learn about him as a watchmaker and his attitude towards it, his philosophy. Because I think there was a lot of wisdom there. And from the people that interviewed him, that's kind of what you get from them, is that he wasn't at all what they heard he was going to be, that he was a very kind, tall, big, but kind man. Very helpful, very thoughtful person. And I think it would have been cool to have met him, but that didn't happen. So, I use what I can to connect to his past. But he has a story. And part of the reason I bring this up is you're going to see how that story pans out here. I watch auctions, not every Saturday, but just about, clock auctions and watch auctions.